Genesis 17, we're going to start reading in verse 15. It says, "And God said unto Abraham, As for Sarai thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be, and I will bless her and give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be the mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her. Then Abraham fell upon his face and laughed, and said in his heart, Shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old? And shall Sarah that is 90 years old bear? And Abraham said unto God, O that Ishmael might live forever. And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him." Let's go ahead and we'll stop there. We're going to look at more as we go, but we'll stop there for now, and let's have a word of prayer. Be seated. This is something that I am confident that everyone in here can relate to, that something has happened that was completely unexpected. That you had no idea was coming your way, and just all of a sudden there it was. Sometimes that can be bad things. That's probably what we think of first. When we think of something unexpected happening, we think of some sort of problem that came out of nowhere and completely blindsided us. Maybe a bill. You're merrily going along your day, and you stop to get the mail, which nothing ever good comes in the mail, but you stop to get your mail, and in it is a letter from the hospital saying that a bill that you thought was completely paid off had some extra charge that you weren't even told about. Now they're going to send to collections unless you pay it all today type deal. That's always a blessing when you get that, and catches you completely unexpected. Or maybe it's something like an unexpected, like a betrayal of a friend. I have a pastor friend who started the church that he's in probably close to 20 years ago, and there has been one family that joined when they started the church. It wasn't the first week, but real shortly after that. They had been there the whole time, was really the pastor's right-hand man, helping in every way, very supportive. Their kids grew up together and grew up best friends, and then suddenly all these years later, I believe it was last year, the family told him that they've been living a lie and hated him this entire time. And that they didn't agree with anything that he preached, and just totally caught him off guard. And I remember when it first happened, he and I were talking, and he was shocked. Didn't know how to even respond, because it was completely unexpected. Maybe it's something like that, or something goes wrong with house or car. Washing machine decides to kick the bucket, the car breaks down, the roof decides to leak. I was out in my garage minding my own business the other day, and suddenly I hear drip, drip, drip. And as a plumber, you have to understand there is nothing that bothers you more than a dripping sound. It's just, there is something wrong with that. So I went on the mission of finding the source of the drip, and I successfully found it, but to my chagrin, it wasn't a plumbing issue, but a roof leak. We have unexpected things like that happen. Sometimes those unexpected things are bad things, but not always. Sometimes unexpected things can be good. I've given this example before, but it's been a while and it's a good one. I've decided, I've been preaching here every Wednesday night for a little over 7 years, and I'm only 30 years old. You've heard all my stories. I don't have any stories to give at this point, so you get a lot of repeats. Decided that's why I keep doing things that some people would deem unwise, because I just need more examples to tell from the pulpit, so I have to do something. I suggested to my wife, she's not in here, she asked what we should do for our anniversary, and I said we should borrow my dad's snowshoes and go snowshoeing. Neither of us have any idea what we're doing or where to go, but what could possibly go wrong? My wife decided that dinner sounded like a better and safer idea, but because of all that, you have to listen to an old example that I've given before. But it fits this well, of an unexpected, but that was a good thing. I had my company, it was in kind of the last stages of closing it, and as I've given example before, things hadn't gone well, and I had spent tons of money on a big project I was on, and then the contractor claimed bankruptcy, which meant I don't get paid. So lots of bills, but no money to pay them. So I daily fielded phone calls of bills that wanted payment right that moment, and I daily explained to them, I have no money, and if I get some, you'll be the first to get payment. But I was telling all of them that same thing, that you'll be the first to get payment. There was one that literally, it was the same lady every single time, and she literally called me every morning at 8 o'clock in the morning. Every single day. Asking, have you gotten money yet you can put down toward this bill? So one morning, they called, and I thought, well, here we go again. Praise the Lord. Here's my phone call from her. I picked up the phone. It was the same lady that I talked to every single morning. I picked up, planning on giving her the same runaround I had every day, and she cuts me off, which I thought was rude, but she cuts me off and says, Mr. Mckenzie, the bill has been paid in full. I can't tell you by who or any other details, but you'll not be hearing from me again. It's paid, or I'll send the receipt in the mail. Have a nice day, and hung up. And it was completely unexpected. I still have no idea who paid it, but that was a really good unexpected. Sometimes unexpecteds are a good thing like that, or maybe some friend that you've not talked to in a long time contacting you out of the blue, or a raise at work that you didn't know was coming. It can be a lot of different things. The point of all this being, we face things all the time that are completely unexpected. Things that happen in our life on a regular basis that we didn't see coming, we didn't realize were going to happen, and that's what we're seeing in the passage that we just read, and really more as we get into the message. Abraham is here being promised to be the father of many nations. God telling him that his children will be as the sand of the sea, and to this point, Abraham and Sarah have yet to be able to have any children. No, it would be easy to say, because this has been a promise for a while now, as at the point when God delivers on it, it would be easy to say that God meant well and probably wanted to deliver, just wasn't able to. That God had good intentions, He just couldn't come through. For Abraham and Sarah to have a child at 99 years old, that's more than just expected or unexpected, that's unheard of. Which is evident by what we see in the passage that we started with. God comes to him and tells Abraham, who is a man who followed God, a man who obeyed God in what seemed like impossible things. But when God tells him this, he and Sarah both laugh at the possibility and then go into questioning God. He didn't question God when God told him leave everything and move. But at this, he questions God and starts bringing up, well, God, are you sure? I have Ishmael. Couldn't we just go with that? It won't that work? And despite that, God can be seen throughout this entire process. This evening, I have three areas that I want to point out tonight. The first is God in the promise. We just read the passage a few moments ago. I'm not going to have us again right now. But let's look at a few things about this promise that we see here. The first is that it came from God. Now think about this. God's previously already told Abraham that he'd be the father of many nations. This happened way before all this. God didn't have to come and tell him again. They probably, this is just simple here, but they probably would have figured it out pretty soon by her belly growing. God didn't have to come and tell them. So why did they need God coming down and telling them? What was the reason for it? And I think the answer is kind of twofold. The first is God came to remind them of His promise. When you think about it, it's something that we see God doing all the time, that He makes a promise in His Word and then sends reminders of His promise. Think of the promise that He made in Genesis. We, a few weeks ago, were looking at Adam and Eve when they sinned, and God promises that His Son's going to come. Between the time that He makes that promise and the time that Jesus is born, there's something like 350 prophecies of His birth. 350 plus times that God says, hey, remember what I said. Remember my promise. That's God giving reminders saying, I haven't forgotten. He's still coming. So the first reason that God came was to give them a reminder of His promise, but then also to show them that it was of God. This isn't something that's just happened. This was designed by God. Brother Pickens earlier was asking me of the songs which I wanted, and I asked him for Is Anything Too Hard for God right before the message, because it fits very, very well that this was designed specifically by God. It was all part of His plan. So we see God in the promise because he personally gave it. We also see God in the promise because it was, I have it written in my notes this way, and I don't know that it's the best wording it could be, but it was a God-only way. Think about this for a moment. That statement, I've noticed, I say that a lot. I must like you to think, but I have to think up here, so you have to think too. But it wasn't an accident that God waited until they were old to give them this child. That wasn't an accident. It wasn't that God had gotten busy and hadn't gotten around to giving them a child yet. It wasn't that God had forgotten that he had promised this, and then one day, did like we do, woke up at 2 a.m. and thought, I forgot about that, I need to do this. That's not what happened. It's not God in the middle of the night going, I forgot, you know what, I'll wake Abraham up and tell him right now. No, this was by design. It was specifically done in a way that it would be seen that this was of God. This was of God. Now, I'm not trying to downplay the birth of a child. It's an amazing thing, absolute miracle. I've got to give my disclaimer. It's an absolute miracle. I can clearly remember the birth of all three of my kids, and they were amazing. To me, Zach was the coolest because Lisa had to have a C-section, and I convinced the doctors to let me look over the top of the blanket while they were doing it all, and that was really neat to see his little purple body actually inside her stomach still. That was really neat. It's one of those, an image that'll never get out of my head. Kind of good, kind of not. So I'm not trying to downplay that at all. I understand that every kid being born is a miracle. But had Abraham and Sarah been at normal childbearing ages, it would have been easy to think that this wouldn't have had to have been from God. I mean, it's a natural thing that happens. But the way that God did this and the timing that he used made it so that no one could have denied this was God. This is a woman that for her entire life couldn't bear children. She wanted to, she tried, but couldn't. And now, when she's old and way past when anyone would have expected her to be able to have a child, God gives her a child. It points directly to God. This isn't something that Abraham and Sarah could have come up with to help God out. That's what Ishmael was. Ishmael was them thinking, well, God isn't going to deliver on his promise, so we'll just have to come up with our own way. This wasn't that at all. This is in a way that was undeniably God. If this promise was going to come through, it wouldn't be because of anything that Abraham or Sarah could have done. If this promise was going to come true, it would have to be by God. There was no other way. Either God was going to do this or there would be no son for Sarah. We can clearly see God in the promise. The passage lays that out for us. God delivered the promise and was doing it in a way that only he could. The next thing I see in this passage is God in the proof. And here's what I mean by that. God didn't just make a promise to Abraham and Sarah, but he followed through on it. He delivered on it. They doubted it. They questioned whether or not he could. Again, that's why we see the birth of Ishmael. That was Abraham and Sarah deciding that God couldn't really do what he said he was going to, so we're going to help him out a little bit. But God wasn't making empty promises. God wasn't just saying words. Just a quick side note. It's not a rabbit trail. I can show you. Look, it's in my notes right there. You can't see that, but I can. Not a rabbit trail, but God never makes an empty promise. If God says he's going to do something, we can be sure that he will. People have that problem, that we make promises that we don't always keep. Sometimes we make promises and sometimes we make promises just because we know it's what people want to hear. I was trying to find a nice way to say that, but I couldn't. That we make a promise or say we're going to do something, oftentimes with no intent of actually doing it. Just because it's what we think people want to hear. That's not what we have here. Sometimes we make promises hoping that we can keep them, but just can't. Sometimes we make promises and just forget it. God doesn't do that. When he makes a promise, when he says he's going to do something, he does. And that's true in our passage. God wasn't making a promise that he couldn't do. God, what's the the old phrase, the proof is in the pudding. Well, here's the pudding. Turn to Genesis 21, verse 1 through 4. Couple of chapters over, verse 1 through 4, it says, "And the Lord visited Sarah, and he said, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken." Notice that first verse. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son in his old age at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of the son that was born unto him, whom Sarah bare to him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac, being 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Very quickly, I kind of tried to highlight as I read it, but a few phrases in these verses. The Lord did as he had spoken. Verse 1 and 2 says that over and over. Visited Sarah as he said. The Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. Verse 2, it says the set time of which God had spoken to him. Putting it pretty clearly. God promised it. God said, this is the way it's going to be. And it was like he said. Was like he said. Everything he told Abraham and everything he told Sarah, he did. Second phrase is at the time of which he had spoken. In verse 2, again, the timing, their age, and when this all came to pass was no coincidence. Was no chance. It didn't just happen to work out that way. It was all God. It was all by his design. It was all by his plan. The third phrase in there is as God had commanded him. Once again, it making it clear that this entire thing was God. Promised by God, planned by God, orchestrated by God, done by God. He didn't just make a promise to Abraham and Sarah. He proved it. He did it. Which is also a pattern that we see from God. I think of Romans 5:8, but God commendeth his love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. That word commendeth means showed or proved. God all through his word tells us he loves us, and then in the act of sending his son to die for our sins, he proved it. He delivered. In this passage, in the birth of Isaac, we can see God in the promise, we can see God in the proof, and then lastly this evening, we can see God in the provision. Or you could say God also, or you could also say God in the protection. If you look over at chapter 22, Genesis 22, starting in verse 1, it says, "And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee in a land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, and saddled his ass, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went unto the place of which God had told him." Skip down to verse 8. "And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together." Skip down to verse 10. "And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took a knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven, and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son. And Abraham lifted up his eyes, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son." Again, think about this. This is unexpected. God has finally given you the son that he promised. You've waited for years for this promise come true. And then after it does, you wake up one morning to God saying, I want you to take that son, your only son, the one I gave you, and sacrifice him to me. And as a dad, I can't imagine what must have been going through Abraham's head. Being totally honest, as a parent, the entire concept is way beyond what we can conceive. The idea of sacrificing your kid to us is unthinkable. But for Abraham and Sarah, there is the added element that this is the son that they had waited so long for. This is the son that the promise that God had given them about being the father of many nations. This is the son that was going to come from. They knew that they weren't spring chickens. They knew that they weren't going to have any more children. If they gave this son, they knew this was their future. This would have been completely unexpected, but once again, God was in it all. If you look at this, as God said, verses 1 and 2, God said to Abraham, "This is what I want you to do." Obviously, that's not a direct quote. He didn't mention anything about in there that he's going to provide another way. We know the end of the story. We have that benefit, but Abraham didn't. He just had to trust God. God said, and then we see in this that God told in the end of verse 3, in the place of which God had told him was out of the blue. It may not have made much sense, and probably was one of the hardest things that Abraham had to face at this point in his life, or at least in my mind it would have been, but it was what God had said to do. God was in it. And the last part with that, God gave. We saw that in verse 10 through 13. Abraham goes up there, has his son on the altar, tied to the altar, ready to do as God commanded, and God gave a lamb. Abraham is in a totally unexpected position, and God was there. God already had a plan in place, and God provided. Now I'm working toward a conclusion here. I established at the start, we all go through times of the unexpected. Like I said earlier, times where we just don't know what's happening. We totally get broadsided by it. And when that happens, people typically have one of two responses. Either they get mad. They are upset. They don't like what's happening. They don't like that they don't have control. Today being my birthday, my wife has, in our marriage, thrown me one surprise birthday party, and only one, because I told her don't ever do that again, because I don't like not having control. I showed up at my house and my response was, why are there people in my home? It really bugged me, but that's often our response is to an unexpected, is we don't have control, so we're upset about it, or we get worried because the unexpected means unknown. We haven't had time to process this all. We haven't had time to figure it out, so our response is panic. Let's instead realize that God is in the unexpected. That God's in it. And though I may not understand it, and though I may not feel comfortable in it, like I'm sure Abraham was not real comfortable in tying his son to the altar, God's in it. Understand that God made a promise. Oh, I don't know. Promises like I'll never leave you or forsake you. Promises like God holds you in His hand. Promises like that He is your shield, your buckler, your high tower. Don't worry. God has made a promise. God has a plan. He's not put us here on earth and just sitting back to see what becomes of us. Don't worry. God has a panic, and He will provide the way. A way for your eternity, but also a way through the day-to-day. So when the unexpected comes, don't get upset, don't get scared, no need to panic, because God's there in the unexpected. When the unexpected of life comes, look to Him. Let's pray.